When does a phenomenon become the unknown? When all attempts at understanding fail, and those who thirst for knowledge and understanding watch as research turns to ash in their mouth, as the phenomenon turns from a riddle to be solved into anomalous fascination. Hello, friends. Thank you for tuning in to episode 9 of the Anomalous Fascination podcast. We've been going for almost 2 months now, and I can tell you that every time I sit down to start recording and writing notes, I find myself completely removed from the world around me. And when I finally check the clock, hours have passed and it felt like minutes. So when I tell you that it's been a pleasure making these episodes, I could not be more sincere. As always, if you have even 2 minutes this week, please tell a friend about the show. Even just a quick message to someone saying, "I've been listening to this new show and it's super interesting," can be a huge deal. And thank you again for all of your support. For this episode, I wanted to take a step outside of the norm of our previous episodes and take a look at our first naturally occurring phenomena on Earth. And I mean Earth, quite literally. It'll be something that many of you may have some familiarity with, but you might not know the whole truth of the matter. For centuries, fairies have been a very common part of our folklore, and even in modern culture, part of our stories and cinema. Particularly in the lore of English-speaking nations such as Scotland, Ireland, and England, they were deeply entrenched as beings of mystery and stories, as either kind beings that you didn't want to cross, or malevolent beings of wanton destruction. Fairies themselves are broken into 2 factions in some folklore: the Seelie and Unseelie courts. Seelie being the ones who might help you wash your clothes or do your chores if you're kind, and Unseelie being the ones who will steal your crops, food and drink, tools, and even milk your cows during the middle of the night, just because they want to. Amongst fairy lore between multiple English cultures, they can be pegged down to 6 common characteristics. 1. Fairies help humans. 2. Fairies can harm humans. 3. Humans can be abducted by fairies for various reasons. 4. Fairies can exchange their own offspring for human babies, which is the original concept of changelings. 5. Humans can be magically charmed to visit the fairyland, sometimes to their doom. And 6. Mortals can sometimes have a fairy mistress or lover. It's a lot, huh? Well, I forgot one other commonality. Fairy rings. It's easy to understand why fairy rings would be so deeply entrenched in folklore, even far-reaching beyond English-speaking nations, because they're everywhere. For those unfamiliar, a fairy ring in Europe or America would be discolored or partly dead patch of grass with a discolored ring around the grass and mushrooms circling the patch in an almost perfect circle. So naturally, it was concluded that these circles were locations where fairies went to dance, celebrate, or even perform magic rituals. And the mushrooms, of course, were seats for the fairies to rest from long nights of dancing and revelry. Well, that's what the English nations thought, at least. German and French lore would cite these locations as witch circles or witch rings, locations where witches would dance or celebrate. Evidently, magical creatures just love dancing. Other countries theorized they were caused by dragons, who cursed the land to only grow toadstools for 7 years. And the Dutch? Well, the Dutch thought the circles marked the locations where the devil had set his milk churn down to churn some milk. Somehow in my mind, this seems more insane than the dragon. Now, of course, there is little agreement across multiple cultures, but fairies are by far the most prevalent. But regardless of what they believed, these rings were such unexplainable phenomena, and so entrenched in superstition, that 100% independently from each other, all of these cultures came to one universal conclusion. Never, ever step inside a fairy ring. Let's take a stroll, shall we? So, why all the fear and superstition around fairy rings in Europe? Well, most likely because for centuries no one had any idea how or why these locations came to be. You see, people use folklore to fill in blanks of their understanding, almost like being handed a half-finished picture and, rather than just letting it be, finishing the picture to the best of your ability. But likely making some inaccurate assumptions of what the artist was going for. Fairy rings, as such, were a more fantastical and complex version of step on a crack, break your mom's back, as the consequences of stepping in fairy rings were extremely dire. Many folks are told of real-life events that transpired after stepping in one, but most are folklore passed down from generations. The most common stories are on entering into the circle and being unable to stop dancing. And unless there's intervention from another person, they'll dance themselves to death. Others deal with more long-term issues surrounding dying at a younger age, destruction of property, or, upon exiting the ring, they find that weeks to months have passed in only a matter of minutes in the ring. And, of course, the lore that fairy rings cannot be destroyed. Or, if they are, they simply return days later. This is one piece of lore they actually got right. Which leads me to the reality of these rings. In 1792, Dr. William Withering discovered the truth behind fairy rings. He dug up the center of numerous fairy rings and found the same thing, a root-like system coming to the center of the circle with a mushroom-like mass. It would later be confirmed that these mushrooms, which would later be determined to be about 60+ species, would start deep in the soil and start breaking down the soil around it for nutrients, and eventually, this portion would dry up. The mushroom would then send out tendrils called hyphae outward in all directions to continually gather more and more nutrients. Eventually, these tendrils would reach a sufficient distance, the interior portion of the mushroom would die, and mushrooms would sprout up out of the ground in a circle surrounding where it had begun, leaving the interior discolored or more devoid of life. So, in not so many words, fairy rings are a result of a unique and complex underground mycelium that spreads out from the center point, making it a circle. These circles can be extremely impressive, being both small enough for just a single person to stand inside, or as big as 10 meters, which is 33 feet in diameter. Whoa. But even as impressive as they may be, there's one thing we can say with relative certainty. Magic had no part in the formation of these rings. Regardless of the fact that this dismissed much of the magic and folklore, after looking at dozens of photos of these, they're quite remarkable. Seeing a shape in the wild that forms an almost perfect circle is just so foreign compared to much in nature, so it was bound to dazzle and bring wonder to people. So, that's it then. We figured it out and it wasn't even that recently. So why am I talking about fairy rings? Well, if you all would take a moment and kindly look at the title of this episode, it is not called fairy rings. It is called fairy circles. Small difference in words, right? So minor that you wouldn't think a thing of it? They couldn't possibly mean something completely different. Well, to both you and I's astonishment, they are. I'd always been fascinated by fairy rings and thought maybe it would be an interesting topic, but I wasn't sure if it would still be considered of unknown origin, which as we now know, it is not. But when I searched for pictures of what I now know are fairy rings, I searched fairy circles, and the image search produced maybe 2 out of 30 pictures featuring the fairy rings we just discussed. The other pictures were remarkable, even more impressive than the rings. So what are fairy circles? And why are they so unknown or unexplainable? Stay tuned after this short break and I'll tell you all about it. We zoom out from Europe and Western culture as our camera view shifts southward, passing Italy, Tunisia, the Congo, and finally landing on the far southwest African nation of Namibia. Panning overhead, we see the Namib Desert, and it looks unusual. Because in lieu of smooth sand or low arid grasslands, we see perfectly polka-dotted landscape as far as the eye can see. Upon zooming in, you would swear that humans had to have been digging for buried treasure, or even an abandoned campsite where a large bonfire had once burnt brightly. However, despite first impressions, these formations appear to be 100% naturally occurring. So, fairy circles. First discovered in Namibia across the deserts and grasslands, these are near-perfect circles just like the fairy rings. But in lieu of mushrooms and low grass, these circle interiors are 100% dirt, with a circle of taller than average wild grass going around it. Also, where the fairy rings were documented as growing up to sizes of 10 meters in diameter, fairy circles have been seen in sizes up to 20 meters, or roughly 65 feet in diameter. And not only can they become enormous, if you were to watch a circle with an overhead camera over years, it would look like they were almost breathing, as they grow and shrink constantly, before finally diminishing around 30 to 60 years of age, when they finally die as they're overtaken by wild grasses in the area. Let me repeat that. These naturally occurring dirt circles grow and diminish in size constantly, and have a life expectancy. What on earth is going on? As we discussed about fairy rings, when there are things we cannot explain, we tend to fill in the gaps with folklore. Though bearing almost no common lore regarding fairies, these phenomena quickly adapted the similar name to the fairy rings of Europe. However, its folklore, though less commonly known, has ranged a much longer time span. Oral tradition of the Himba people of the area can range from stories of these being caused by footsteps of the gods, spirits of the dead, or even more natural deities of the earth. Unlike the fairy circles in Europe, the superstition associated with them is about as different as you can get, with fairy circles being said to possess both spiritual and magical powers, which sometimes would be imbued to those who set foot inside or perform certain rituals within the circle. And with many tour guides, a tale of unknown origin is often told, suggesting that a dragon lives within the earth and that its poisonous breath kills the vegetation. So, we have mycelia for fairy rings. So what have we got for fairy circles? Well, there have been multiple theories, only a couple of which hold much water. Despite numerous theories regarding radioactive soil and plant toxins, which couldn't possibly account for the immense quantity of locations or why they are circles, there are two theories that have led the way for quite some time. The first being seemingly the most logical. This is some rough terrain and competition for water is fierce. So the first theory suggests that plants grow in large patches, and along the outside of the patch it grows thicker the farther it goes out. And the larger plants on the outside eventually prevent water from getting to the center, which completely kills off the plant life in the center of the patch, forming a circle of dead earth. Which sounds good in theory. However, upon inspection of the areas, when digging into many of these circles, layers of moisture were still found in the center portion, suggesting that lack of water could not have been the cause of them. The second theory, which had held water for the longest time, no pun intended, was proposed by a Dr. Norbert Jurgens, who suggested that under the circles, he would find a considerable amount of colonies of a specific type of termite. In fact, his research was claiming he would find them between nearly 80 to 100% of these fairy circles. Not only that, but this particular type of termite spanned the entire area where the fairy rings were known to exist, namely Namibia. It gained some popularity in the media when it was proposed in the late 2000s to the early 2010s. And even as it received criticism from others who had searched for termites in those areas with no success, he had answers for those questions as well. So, sounds reasonable enough, right? You must get tired of me asking these questions, knowing full well this is not the end of the story. In 2014, some discoveries were made that turned Jurgen's termite theory into dust. These fairy circles that seemed to be limited solely to Namibia had begun being spotted in lower parts of South Africa for a few years, which, although outside the normal range of this variety of termites, not out of the question. But when it was first discovered that fairy circles had sprung up in West Australia, the termite theory suddenly didn't hold water, because these kinds of termites are not local to Australia, and upon research, none were found there either. Additionally, many in the scientific community had not taken Jurgen's theory too seriously, as they believed that this was a common case of mistaking correlation for causation, as the termite theory didn't account for everything, particularly the lifespan of these circles, which averaged, as I said, 30 to 60 year lifespans, decades longer than the average survival of these termite colonies. So once again, a recent development has left us throwing up our hands and saying, I don't know. Well, most of us anyways. I mentioned before regarding the folklore for fairy circles, that though there were less tales and superstition, it had lasted quite a bit longer than that of the European fairy rings. So how long, you ask? Well, let's put it this way. Some of them are still being proposed to this day. Folklore today? What do you mean? Well, what was once called folklore in centuries past, we now call the paranormal. Where generations before us had leaned on folklore to describe the unknown, our modern-day peers have found their own way of filling in the blanks on unexplainable phenomena. Aliens. That's right, despite never walking into a topic with any knowledge of paranormal theories, it seems that where mysteries appear, alien theories are not too far behind. To be clear, I mean no disrespect to those of the alien conspiracy persuasion. This show just tends towards focusing more on the theories of scientific origin. Regarding the alien theories, many believe that these large patches of ground are created as signs, language, or directions to their fellow aliens. Unlike crop circles, however, these circles do not have any intricacy to them, as they're merely flat circles with no artistic design. So, how exactly are plain circles supposed to transmit a message? It's believed that these large series of dots in a particular sequence may transmit messages. Kind of like Morse code for aliens. Hey, honestly, more probable than crop circles. Oh, and one more thing. In fairness to these theories, as unbelievable as it may seem, in many areas pocked with seemingly endless fairy circles, they are actually visible from space. So, there. I've explained the modern-day folklore of these circles. And who knows? Maybe one day, after we've scoffed our last scoff, we'll suddenly learn that the many unexplainable phenomena in the world had a simple explanation all along. That the alien theorists were right. Thank you again for listening to this episode of Anomalous Fascination. If you'd like to keep in touch with the show, you can find me at AnomalyPod on Twitter, or email me at anomalousfascination@gmail.com. And if you love the show, hop on Apple Podcasts and leave a nice 5-star rating and review. And until next time, thanks for listening.